Hey, what's up guys? Red Bishop of the Press A to Listen podcast here, and we have another video review for you, this time for Murdered Soul Suspect from Airtight Games and Square Enix. For those that are unfamiliar with Murdered Soul Suspect, the story takes place in Salem, Massachusetts, home of the Salem witch trials, and the goal of the story is to solve your own murder. You play as Ronan, and the beginning of the game takes place where you're in this apartment building. You go all the way up to the attic. You are thrown from the attic window onto the street below, and from there on you are trying to figure out what happened to you, why it happened to you, and who's the person that did it to you. And along the way you come across these puzzle solving scenes, which we'll get to in a minute. But there's a specific character in the game named Joy, who, even though you're a ghost, is a medium, so she can still see you, she can still hear you, and she turns into being somewhat your sidekick in the story. She helps you get to some places you can't actually get to, because in the game you can't go into a building if the door is closed. You can't go through a building through the exterior walls. Once you're in a building, though, you can go through just about any wall in the building, but you have to have someone to open the door for you to get in. So Joy does that. She'll help you find, when you find certain objects that you can't actually pick up, you ask her for your assistance. She'll come over and she'll pick up the painting or whatever you need to help you solve these puzzles or these crime scenes. Not only that, but Joy plays a big part in the story. Later on in the game, or about halfway through the game, you're trying to find her mother, who is a psychic, and you're trying to find her to help you solve your own murder. So even though you're doing some of these missions with her, it still all comes back to trying to solve your own murder from the very beginning of the game. Now we're going to move on from the story for a minute because I don't want to spoil too much. It does have some nice twists and turns in there. But the gameplay itself mainly revolves around you going to certain scenes or going to certain buildings and trying to solve puzzles. These puzzles are very simplistic, and there's no way to actually fail the puzzles. They have 3 badges that are at the bottom of the screen that you'll see in this gameplay here that act as your score. Obviously, if you have all 3 of them, the higher your score, but the score doesn't really impact anything. And you can get all the way down to 1 badge, and if you mess up that 3rd and final time, the game doesn't stop. It doesn't say game over, do it again. You can just keep trying and trying. So they tried to implement some sort of scoring feature, but it doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't actually mean anything to the game. The aforementioned puzzle solving and crime solving scenes, which are about 90% of the gameplay, act like CSI or the NCIS video games that came out over the last few years, if anyone's ever played those. This means that when you go to a room in a specific building, or if you go outside to an alleyway or something like that where you need to progress, there will be certain items or objects on the ground that you need to inspect, you need to observe, and it'll tell you in the bottom left-hand corner how many clues there are and how many you found. Once you find all the clues in a specific area, majority of the time you can just hit the Y button on the 360, Xbox One, or triangle on PS3 and PS4 to conclude your investigation, and you can go on to the next area of the game. But there are some times where you need to piece together what exactly happened in a specific area. So once you do that, you go into a somewhat of a mini game where every clue that you found shows up on the screen, and you need to figure out which is the most relevant to the actual crime. And this is where I mentioned earlier, where the 3 badge scoring comes into effect, where no matter how many times you fail, so you can guess every clue that you have available until you get it right. You can't fail. The game does not end. You keep going. You don't lose anything in the story, and that's where the kind of main gameplay aspect kind of shuts down. Is if they had a way for you to actually fail, then I think the gameplay would be a little bit more rewarding. But instead, with you able to just click on every clue that you have, there's no incentive to play smart or to play like an actual detective, because you can't actually fail the minigame. The other part of the game that pertains to the puzzle solving and crime solving is the fact that you can mind read, influence, and you can peek at certain people. By mind read, it means you can possess someone's body, and you can read their mind and see what they're saying and stuff like that. You can also influence, which means if you find a clue in some of the crime scenes or some of the scenes themselves, you can influence them with a clue that you have. So basically it will jolt their memory and have them think about that, and it will tell you whether you're right or you're wrong. And the peek functionality just means that if there's Like at the very beginning of the game, if there's a cop that has a notepad, you can peek at that notepad and see what he's written down and see if that can help you with your investigation of solving your own murder. That part of the game I mentioned is about 90% of what you're going to be doing. The other 10% is actual combat. There's no shooting, so there's no third-person shooter for anybody that's fatigued out on shooters. It's more of a stealth combat game. There are certain demons that are still in Salem, Massachusetts, because they're not able to get to the afterlife because of some of the things that they did when they were on Earth. You have to try to exorcise them, so to speak. So what you have to do is you have to sneak behind them, hold right trigger or R2 to exorcise them and get rid of them. The downside to doing this is that obviously it's the worst part of this game. The upside is that it's such a small minority of the game. You can tell it was not in this game when it first came to fruition, when it first had these ideas and everything, that it was tacked on later on because probably Focus Group realized that it needed to have some sort of combat. You can't just have a puzzle solving game or crime solving game and that be the whole game. To get away from the gameplay for a couple of minutes and talk about the actual town itself in Salem, Massachusetts, there are tons of collectibles in this game. If you go from just the museum to the police station to the cemetery to just walking the streets of Salem, you will more than likely find collectibles. There are 173 collectibles in this game. And I know if you hear that number and your first thought is, damn, that's a lot of collectibles. They're not really hidden all that well. Most of them, like I said, just walking the streets, you'll see 2 or 3 of them because they all have this gold light beaming from them, so you can't miss them. You pretty much see every single one, so they're not difficult at all to find. And the collectibles themselves add a little bit more story to the game. And by that is they'll add some backstory. There are one specific thing in a area where you need to find 7 buzzsaws. When you find those saws, you get the backstory to that saw and what it did in Salem, what that specific weapon did in that town. So it does add some more stuff to it if you're the person that likes backstory. Another thing that the town does is there are tons of ghost buildings and objects. And what this means is going back to when the Salem witch trials took place, you'll see some of the buildings that were there during that time period. You will also see stuff like you'll see train tracks, and you'll even see a train go by every now and then that in the modern time, the people that are actually living in that town that you run across don't see. Only people in the afterlife that are ghosts can actually see these old buildings and these old objects. So it adds some kind of life and atmosphere to the game. It's kind of adds a little spooky atmosphere to it that I actually really like. There are also certain ghosts that are in Salem, Massachusetts that you need to help out and need to help them figure out why they died or why they did the things that they did. And this turns into that that puzzle solving and crime solving thing that we talked about earlier. The main gameplay is there'll be certain clues that you need to find, and once you find those clues, you go back and talk to that ghost, and it explains to them, hey, this is why you died, or hey, this is why you did what you did, or why you think that you're responsible when you're actually not. So even when you're not playing the main story, there are still enough missions for you to do outside of the main story to keep you occupied. Now with this, we're going to actually call this video review. The game itself, I think the story is actually pretty good. I think they do a good job with the twists and turns of it. I think the speed of the story, I think it keeps flowing. You're never missing any of the story in action. But the gameplay itself leaves to be desired. I think the crime solving and puzzle solving section is actually well done, except for the fact that there's actually no fail state. So there's no rewarding factors for you doing it. So that when you solve a puzzle or a crime, you don't sit there and say, yeah, I'm so glad I did that. I figured that out. Because you can simply do trial and error and keep spamming to find stuff. So unfortunately, that hinders the game. Also, the stealth combat, which is not very good at all. It is very, very annoying to do. Makes almost no sense. There's no need for demons to actually be there the way that they're introduced to the game. And the combat itself, the hiding from them, then having to come out and exorcise them, just in theory might sound good on paper to certain people, to the developers and stuff, but in practice it does not do too well. So I think for $60 on Xbox One and PS4, $50 on 360, PS3, and PC, it's very hard to recommend this game if you're going to do it just for the gameplay. If you're into these kind of stories about the Salem witch trials, about if you like the Blair Witch Project, if you like those kind of movies and books and TV shows and stuff, I would say it's worth it just for the story. But because it takes about 8 to 10 hours to complete the story. But if you're not interested at all in the story, the gameplay is just going to end up leaving you feeling like you spent money that you should have saved for another game, because the gameplay is just not all there. But with that, we're going to end the video review. Hope you enjoyed, and thanks for listening.